Hello and welcome to Extraordinary with me, James Wallace, the podcast that shines a light on ordinary people who have gone on to do and see extraordinary things. And in this episode, I'm joined by LGBT dating coach and relationship expert. It's Max Thomas.
It turns out there's actually loads of research out there on specifically the psychology of how LGBTQ people think differently or act differently. You kind of have to learn how to navigate when you can be yourself and where you can be yourself, because most queer people still can't.
Why do gay people find it so difficult to open up and to build connections with people?
On average, compared to women, men often aren't as good at expressing their emotions. Emotions are bad and to be avoided, where many of us are just afraid to share the things about ourselves that would let other people connect with us. The more you're able to share who you actually are, the more you're going to kind of start to connect with the people who are right for you. You go on a date and it's pretty good, and you're like, maybe there's something better on the app. And then you go on a date and it's actually really good, and you're like, maybe there's something even better on the app. Again, the studies have shown that LGBTQ people tend to kind of take rejection to heart a lot more on average than straight people do. If you don't tell anyone, if you're not upfront when someone says, what do you want? You're like, yeah, I'm like open to anything, then it's kind of what you're gonna get. Like, respect the dead. If somebody has ghosted you, then wish them well. Do them a little funeral, hold a little funeral for what you shared together, and move on.
Let's talk about sex.
If I do this, if I have this kind of sex, what does that say about me? It is a myth that relationship sex is always better than casual sex.
What you're making is a case for open relationship.
And put it this way, how many relationships that say they're monogamous, that are monogamous in theory, are actually monogamous in practice? For a long time, people assumed that LGBTQ people had kind of mental health issues because they were rejected by society as a whole, and that made them feel kind of less than and whatever. And basically it is that, but it's also the ways we reject each other and we dismiss each other. Once people become aware of it, often that's enough.
Before we begin this episode, I'd just like to remind everyone that this podcast is not monetized or sponsored in any way, which is why I've signed up to buymeacoffee.com, which allows content creators like me to raise funds to contribute towards the ongoing costs and maintenance of running a podcast. So if you did want to donate a small amount, I've set mine at just £3. You can find the link in the show notes below. With that being said, and without any further ado, enjoy the show. So Max, thank you so much for joining me today. As you know, I have been looking forward to this for so long, and it was so difficult for me to sort of think of all the things that I need to ask you today, because you literally talk about everything that I am so interested and passionate about. So thank you once again. Before we dig into everything that we need to talk about, it's probably worth you telling everyone, for those who don't know, who you are and what you do.
Yeah, for sure. Well, thanks so much for having me today. I'm really excited to be here. And yeah, so my name is Max. I am a dating and relationship coach for queer men, and also the author of a book called Boys Who Like Boys, which is about dating and relationships specifically for gay, queer, bi men.
Amazing. And it's probably worth me asking at this point, how does someone write a book about gay dating? Like, where did the book come about?
Right. That's a really good question. In a very literal sense, I read a handful of self-help development books, that sort of thing, and got tons of information that was really useful about life. I'd actually ages and ages ago read a couple of books about dating for men, but obviously they were focused mostly on straight dating and straight men and how they navigate their challenges. And obviously it occurred to me, having done my fair share of dating and had my own fair share of good and bad experiences, that we kind of really needed something for us as well. So that was the kind of impetus of it. If you read the book, you'll know it starts with this story. There was one ghosting too many, and especially bad ghosting just kind of pushed me over the edge. And I was like, not just for me, but for all of us, there's definitely something there that we kind of don't get from parents and we don't get from family. Obviously, most of us are raised by straight parents, and the world of dating today is very different with apps. I'm sure, I know we'll dive into that. So that was the kind of practical thing for that. in terms of actually writing the book, so the book is kind of a mix of, there's some personal experiences in there. I did a lot of research, actually. I read quite a lot of research papers. And it turns out there's actually loads of research out there on specifically the psychology of how LGBTQ people think differently or act differently. And a lot of it's to do with homophobia and societal stuff like that. But it kind of, I really opened I opened a much bigger can of worms than I was expecting to. There was way, way more to dive into there. And as I was sort of reading this stuff, I was like, why do most of us not know this? Why are we not all having conversations about, which I'm sure we'll get onto these things like rejection sensitivity and how homophobia can like limit us in terms of how we show up in our relationships and not, and stuff like that. So yeah, so that was basically the journey of how the book came about.
Yeah, and it's worth me saying that I have read the book. So I'll say it at this point of the podcast. If you haven't, please go and get the book. It's on Amazon. I've got it on my Kindle. It's a brilliant, brilliant read. It's got lots of color, lots of shade. And it's just fantastic because, to your point, this isn't just like a gay guy's opinion on what it's like to date. It is all backed up with research. I learned so much, to your point, about rejection sensitivity, and there's minority stresses, and there's just so many things that I think we as gay people experience, and our lived reality is actually quite different to our heterosexual peers, I would argue.
Exactly. And obviously, I'm sure we'll get into this. A lot of stuff in the book is just about dating relationships in general. But number one, I tried to put in plenty of queer humor in there as well, but also to kind of frame it, in language that that queer men would associate with. But there's so much. Again, I was just like, why do we not know this? Why are we not having these conversations?
Absolutely. So let's talk about gay dating then.
Yeah.
And my opening kind of thought is, and we've already touched on it briefly already, but is it fair to say that queer people have a harder time of dating than our heterosexual peers? Is it that different?
That's a good question. Is it harder? I guess what I would definitely say is there are challenges that we face that straight people don't. I'm sure, I don't know how many straight people listen to this podcast, and dating for anyone is difficult. Dating in the age of apps and ghosting and all of that stuff is difficult, but there definitely are specific challenges for LGBTQ people and sometimes actually for men as well. And we may dive into those things later. Let's see how we go. But one of the simple things is that in a lot of ways, it is harder to meet partners for LGBTQ people because we are a smaller community, and it's kind of, we're still not at the stage where you can kind of just go up to someone who you have no idea, how they identify romantically, sexually like that. You can't really just hit on someone on the bus just in case they turn out to be straight and homophobic. So there's that side of things. But there is the kind of whole side of how, and as I say, this was one of the biggest things writing the book that really kind of landed for me, or kind of really hit home, is how much homophobia causes us to kind of shut ourselves off emotionally, or kind of close ourselves down emotionally, or not really put ourselves out there. And so, and that's kind of the reason, we end up with this like hookup culture, which serves some people, which doesn't serve other people, but a lot of what we do is impacted in kind of often quite subtle ways that do kind of add extra challenges to what we do.
So when you say broadly speaking, a lot of it is to do with homophobia that, triggers us to shut down. It just expands on that a little bit. Is that because we internalize some sort of shame and we're scared of being rejected, so therefore we don't open ourselves up? Is that kind of what you're getting at? Yeah,
so that is definitely one side of it. I think the way one really kind of clear way I can explain it is, I did on my Instagram a few weeks ago. I do these posts 2-3 times a week about different things. And one was just called Why Queer Men Are So Fucking Avoidant. And it's basically that as LGBTQ people, we grow up We learn that we're different in some ways, and we learn that we're different in ways that we're not likely to be celebrated for, at least sometimes, or, and it's that classic thing of you kind of have to learn how to navigate when you can be yourself and where you can be yourself, because most queer people still can't. We still, even if, even those of us that are super, out and proud in different ways, we tend to always be conscious of like, oh, is that person gonna make my life difficult? Or, most of us are like constantly scanning our environments, unless, you're in a really super safe space for like, can I be myself here? And even if the answer is yes, like we've always got that going on, which straight people don't have, which straight and cis people don't have. But then that tends to transfer over into relationships, that we can be really sensitive to like any sign that someone doesn't like us. So many times with friends, but also in my coaching work, I hear about relationships where there's a relatively small problem that a straight couple might chat about, maybe feel a bit uncomfortable, but might kind of deal with. But we're kind of so used to having to protect ourselves, because again, that's what happens when you live in a homophobic world. That if a small thing comes up, we can really shut down and be like, oh, I can't deal with this. Like, I'm not going to talk to that person. I'm just going to cut that person out of my life. Sometimes, even though you might have been dating for 6 months or whatever. And I'm not saying, obviously everyone does that, but that's one example of how we can kind of be used to. There's this great phrase. Did I use it in the book? But I definitely found it in the research of how like the scars of the closet can stay with us into our, like, psychologically, we can still be kind of doing that. And so that's an example of, how that process of really having to fight to like figure out who we are, never mind be who we are, can kind of really kind of hang over into the way we relate with each other, even though we might be completely safe in a relationship, but we might not feel it. The tiniest thing can come up that can make us feel like, oh, I have to go into self-defense mode emotionally or physically or whatever.
And I think that's such a poignant point, though, about we still wear the scars of our closeted lives into our, out existence. And I think it's, playing devil's advocate, and to any straight people listening to this, you may be sitting here thinking, what are you talking about? Like, we live in a world where millions of people take to the streets of London every June and wave their pride flags. And, you can get married in this country legally now. And we've moved on. Like, we live in a post-Section 28 world. But for what people fail to realize is that for most gay men, and I'm talking about gay men because that's the I can identify with, we live in the closet for probably the first 18 years of our lives, where we are essentially living a double life. And that in turn creates deep traumas and deep wounds.
Exactly.
And those, to your point in the book, those scars never fade, because we are still censoring ourselves. We're still self-editing in every situation. I make a point on my TikTok, if you haven't seen already, like, we come out every single day in one way or another.
Exactly.
Even when colleagues at work ask you what you're up to this weekend, and, you might be on a date or you might be seeing your boyfriend, but you've got to kind of explain that you're not actually straight and you're gay, and, going to the barbers, obviously the obvious one, getting to an Uber. Yeah. There's so many situations. And each time that you have to do that, it kind of makes you feel a little bit less than, a little bit inferior.
Exactly.
And I guess that's what you mean, putting words in your mouth here.
No,
when you say we live in a homophobic world.
Exactly. And exactly, that's a really good distinction to make. I actually had this conversation with a straight female friend who, for whatever reason, she lives by London Bridge, and she has tons of like gay male friends. That's just obviously her thing. And we were having this conversation. She was like, well, isn't it? But like, you have equal rights now. You can basically do what you want. And in theory. But in practice, it's exactly what you say, that like, even the fact that we have that mental burden of, on Monday when we're back at work, how honest can we be about what we did this weekend? Yeah. And maybe you did something that was kind of, super crazy, or that you'd want to be kind of careful about who you told anyway. But maybe it wasn't. Maybe it was just, you had a really nice date with your boyfriend, and maybe you've not told your colleagues yet, and you don't know how they're going to react. So you're like, do I want to open that can of worms? Do I want to deal with that? Because that's not. I didn't create this problem, but I have to deal with it, if that makes sense. And it's just even the mental weight of that. Like, what can I say? How do I have to filter myself? And that's the thing that, we all filter ourselves in different ways. We don't tell everyone we know everything about our lives, but straight people never have to filter in the same way that we do when it comes to relationships, when it comes to sex, when it comes to that. And basically the research is pretty clear on that just the weight of that in itself, however we deal with it, is a lot that kind of really weighs on us psychologically. And and that's the crazy, I say this in the book, things have never been better. I'm going to take that back. Things in the arc of history, in this exact moment, there's some things we're kind of working through, but in the arc of history, things are definitely better than they were, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago, legally and in practice. But yeah, how many weeks ago was it there was the attack outside, was it Two Brewers in Clapham?
Yeah.
In one of the most LGBT friendly neighborhoods in one of the most LGBT friendly cities, in Europe. And straight people don't get attacked for being straight, so there's all of that. And whether the physical effects on us, we can debate how big they are, the actual outcome, but certainly the psychological outcome or the psychological effects are still with us.
And then how does the homophobic world that we live in, back to dating, transpose itself into actually taking yourself on a date? Because I guess to go back to where we started, if we're saying that gay men in particular find it hard to date in the first place, maybe because we live in a homophobic world, how does that work on the actual date? Why do gay people find it so difficult to open up and to build connections with people?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And this kind of brings in the kind of two sides of, if you're a queer, gay, bi, pansexual man, of like being LGBTQ, but also being men. And there is plenty of research that talks about how, on average, compared to women, men often aren't as good at expressing their emotions and accepting them. They're just even accepting that they have emotions sometimes. And I know, like, I've always laughed because, like, the sort of stereotype of the, like, super kind of like stoic or emotionless man is like a thing that most gay men don't. Most gay men are, like, at least at some level in touch with a kind of softer side, whether they want to call it feminine side or not, but certainly a softer side. But that still comes with us, that there's this kind of cultural expectation that most men grow up learning that we can't express our emotions and emotions are bad and to be avoided, whereas women, culturally, again, it's a stereotype, but it's definitely true, on average, that women are much better at talking about their emotions, identifying the emotions. So that's a big part of it. But again, it's just that a lot of us learn that if we are too honest about who we are and how we feel, we might get rejected in an actually kind of painful way that says, because homophobia really is a kind of rejection that just says you're less than as a person, you're not valid as a person, you kind of, the word deviant was used for a long time for gay men. And so it's just all this baggage that we bring, and it massively limits the way we build relationships with each other. Because if I think we've all been on dates with that person who, maybe was just a bit quiet or whatever, but it's really hard to connect with someone who, are on the apps when people are like, hey, how's it going? Fine. And you're like, well, like, okay, but, like, what are you up to today? Not much. And and again, maybe that's just someone who's not super talkative, but it's kind of, we also have this baggage of, can we be ourselves? And the answer is, in the right environment, yes. But if we're not, it's really difficult to start building those, any kind of emotional connection. And I'm sure we'll probably dive into this a bit more later. And I'm not saying, the first thing you should say when you meet someone on a date is like, oh, by the way, here's something that massively traumatized me when I was 15. How are you? Like, obviously, obviously vulnerability, which is what we're talking about, grows over time as you get to know someone better. But we really have to learn to start putting our kind of best foot forward and be happy to talk about how we feel and what we're up to, to start building those connections.
100%. And it feels like it's all connected as well, because it's all part of the same story. We grow up in the closet feeling less than, really internalizing feelings of gay shame, we then look at the world around us and we are aware that actually we are tokenized a lot in society. We do live in a homophobic world, or not an inclusive world, maybe is potentially a different way of saying it. And then we go on dates and we still bring all of that baggage to the date, and we refuse, or we don't allow ourselves to be totally vulnerable, open, honest, authentic by saying who we are and what we want. And to your, the apps, and thankfully no longer on them, but it is a hellish place with the lack of chat. And it's interesting that and correct me if I'm wrong here, but what you're essentially saying is that one of the main reasons why there is such little give on the apps is because we're scared of rejection, ultimately, is what we're talking about.
Well, that's a huge part of it. That's basically the book is about. It's not just about internet dating, although obviously online dating is a huge part of how we do things. But so we just kind of ended up in this culture where many of us are just afraid to share the things about ourselves that would let other people connect with us, because we're afraid of rejection. Basically, we're afraid of saying anything that might make someone somewhere reject us. But that's the thing with vulnerability, that whoever you are going to be rejected for some reason. So you're just not going to be, no one is everyone's type, that thing. But the more you're able to share who you actually are, the more you're going to kind of start to connect with the people who are right for you, if that makes sense. And, there's tons of things about the apps. I talk about them in more detail in the book. And part of it is just like, there's too much choice. There's like an endless stream, especially if you live in a big city. There's just an endless stream of people. So you you go on a date and it's pretty good. And you're like, maybe there's something better on the app. And then you go on a date and it's actually really good. And you're like, maybe there's something even better on the app. Whereas and that's true for straight people to an extent. It's true for everyone. But certainly for gay men, 20, 30 years ago, you were maybe meeting in bars, at events, or personal ads in the paper. If you met one or two great people a month, that's amazing. That's an amazing month. Whereas on the apps, you could potentially connect with 20 great people. Maybe you wouldn't meet them all, but you could definitely connect with 20 great people on the apps. And it's it's called the paradox of choice. There's too much choice. So we never kind of settle in that way. It's kind of the three things I say in the book, the kind of three sort of not umbrellas, what's the word? That three areas that make dating challenging for us. Is one is that we have all this baggage of homophobia and being LGBT. The second thing is being men. We have a lot of work to do to kind of get through all of that cultural baggage. And the third thing is just the internet is great in so many ways, but it really has changed the way we date and love and have sex and all of those things. And if you're kind of not aware of the downsides of the limitations, it can really kind of trap you in the place that, a lot of gay men, a lot of queer men feel that they'll never find somebody to love. They might be able to have as many hookups as they want, but finding a lasting relationship, even for a couple of years, doesn't exist anymore. And it does. It's just we live in this culture that's not really primed to make that easy and obvious sometimes.
That's so interesting. And based on all of that you just walked us through, what's the connection between that and rejection sensitivity to what you talked about?
Sure.
Why do gay people, I keep saying gay, queer people.
No, it's fine. It's fine. It's fine.
Why are we particularly predisposed to finding rejection so difficult?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. Kind of one of the key things, that is in the book and that I found out doing all of this research. And basically the studies basically say that because queer people are used to being rejected from society as a whole, that really sensitizes us to any kind of rejection. It's a trauma, basically. It's a kind of trauma. Because again, it's the thing of scanning the environment wherever we are to be is that person going to reject me? And by the way, emotional rejection, or rejection without any physical damage, anything like that, can also hurt. There's some research that says rejection can, like, it fires up the same areas in your brain as like physical pain. So, rejection isn't fun for anyone, but we deal with so much rejection on a societal level. And again, it can be these tiny little things. But it sensitizes us to it, so that basically anytime we're rejected, we tend to kind of like bring up, this is the thing about trauma, right? It brings up all of a lot of the rejection we felt in other ways. So someone in that might be like, not really my type, sorry. And like, you're like, well, fine, there's like 800 other people on the app that I'm speaking to anyway. So, but you can still have that feeling of like, oh, we're way more predisposed to be like, oh my God, I'm unlovable, I'm terrible, I'm an awful person, the whole world is rejecting me. When in fact, and I think most LGBTQ people experience this regularly, where, you don't get a job, or you're turned down for something, and you kind of, might be nothing to do with the relationship, or maybe it's a friend that doesn't want to hang out with you as much anymore, and you're like, well, did I say something, or did I do something wrong? And it might just be like the friend is busy right now, or it might just be you were not the right person for the job. But like, again, the studies have shown that LGBTQ people, we tend to kind of take rejection to heart a lot more on average than straight people do. Not that straight people don't feel it, but like, but if you think about, a super confident, they stereotype like super confident straight guy, and it's just like, yeah, a woman sent him down on a day, and he's like, fine, whatever, plenty more fish in the sea, or he doesn't get the promotion at work, and he's like, fine, and he carries on. Obviously, straight people do have feelings as well. Someone can quote me on that. But it just shifts the dial for us, that we're much more likely to really internalize rejection as there's something wrong with us, or we're the problem.
So true. Yeah. And it's something that I've unpacked a lot in therapy, because it shows up in so many different ways, like your relationships with your family, your friends, your colleagues. It's not just being rejected in the literal sense on a date, but it's having a sensitivity or predisposition for being the victim in situations. Exactly. So I think queer people, gay men, are naturally maybe a little bit more sensitive than their straight counterparts. And for us, trying to find our place in the world, when we get a rejection, it feels like it cuts a bit deeper. I don't have lived experience of being a straight person, but I look around, to your point, when you look at my straight friends who get rejected or things don't work out for them, they seem to have a bit more resilience.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's the big thing. We may get onto this in more detail later. It's just, they're just less afraid of putting themselves out there. And obviously they benefit from that, whether it's it's that you miss 100% of the shots you don't take. Like, you're not gonna, if you're looking for a new job, if you don't apply anywhere, if you don't start putting yourself out, then it's the same in dating. The more you hold back, because you're like, oh, what if somebody doesn't like me? Then you're not giving yourself chance to make those connections.
Yeah, and it's very funny. And I've got a real life example of this, because I was going for drinks with a couple of mates, and everyone was going around the circle talking about their dating, and everyone did the classic, oh, I just want to find someone, I'm done with the dating. Oh, sorry, something just fell.
That's right. Trying to go back again.
No, it's good. Everyone was going around in the circle, telling stories of what dates they've been on, and then it naturally progressed into the chat being around, I just want to find someone long term. I'm done with dating. Grindr's shit, Hinge's shit, Tinder's shit, blah 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 blah. And then I was like, oh, okay, so like, what dates did you go on this week? And they were like, oh, I met a really nice guy. And I was like, what did you say? And they basically revealed that they didn't open up and say that they wanted a long-term relationship. They went down the road of, I'm just, looking, to make connections and make friends. And if something comes of it, then great. And if it doesn't, then we can just be friends. And it's kind of that mindset so many people in their 20s and 30s are in, of dating with good intent, wanting to find someone long term, but then they go on the date and then they end up not saying what they want, and they get upset when they get ghosted or rejected. And I was like, well, you're not attracting the right people to you.
Exactly. Yeah, and there's a lot of truth in that, and that's like the classic example of, if you say you want a long-term relationship and you actually follow through, and you're not just saying that because you feel like you have to, or whatever. There's all kinds of different things you can want from relationships. But you will find loads of people that you're not a match for. Somebody might not be ready to be in a serious relationship in the way that you want. Somebody might just want short-term things, and that's equally as valid, whatever that is, whether that's kind of short-term relationships or just completely casual sex and nothing more than that. But yeah, if you don't, what you're trying to do is like put that out there without, you don't need to like turn into a big parade, although you can, you're welcome to, but you don't need to kind of go massively over the top with it. But if you put it out there and you're like, this is what I'm looking for, and you mean it, other people are looking for the same, then get a chance to find you, right? But it's exactly as you say, if you don't tell anyone, if you're not upfront when someone says, what do you want? You're like, yeah, I'm like open to anything, then it's kind of what you're gonna get. Like, maybe if that other person does it, then, the other person says they want a serious relationship, then you can respond to them and be like, oh, okay, well, actually, that's what I want too. But even that, for some people, doesn't happen that often.
And then I guess you're dealing with the whole issue of thinking that you can change them. Because even if you're there thinking that you want a long-term relationship and you want a boyfriend and you want to get married and have kids, and they're like, yeah, I'm recently broken up and, I'm just seeing what's out there. Nothing too serious at the moment. I mean, I've heard that so many times. And then you're sat there thinking, oh, that's okay because I'm going to make them fall in love with me. I'm going to take them to an expensive restaurant, or I'm going to make it. And I think, based on what I've seen you publish, that is never going to happen.
Yeah, it's almost never. Let's never say never. Like, it can happen. But this is the big thing that you want to be clear about what you want, and you want to expect other people to be clear about what they want. And what I mean by that is, if they're like, well, I don't really know what I want, you're not going to be like hounding them and be like, well, tell me, like, I need to know. If somebody is unclear, if somebody's unclear or says they don't know what they want, that is also a signal that they're probably not going to offer you what you're looking for, if there's a specific thing in terms of, long-term relationship or whatever that is. But I did this post on, I think it was yesterday, about most of this. I was really interested actually, because sometimes when I do the post on my Instagram profile, MaxThomasNet, I do a question thing of have you ever experienced this? And people feel like that you kind of, usually it's like yes, no, kind of, the three options. And one of them was for people who had been in a relationship where they thought the other person wasn't quite where they wanted them to be, but they were like, so this was of the people who were like, maybe they'll change, things will change. And the options I gave were, that person did not change at all. That person changed a little bit. I kind of got what I wanted. Or that person, sorry, let me say again. So the person did not change at all. The person changed a little bit, but I didn't quite get what I want, or I got exactly what I want by waiting and hoping somebody would change. Not a single person, I can't remember exactly how many people responded, but it was quite a few, but not a single person said, yes, that person became exactly who I hoped they would.
Yeah.
And that's the thing, that there are plenty of people out there. Basically, almost whatever you want, as long as it's more or less legal and not immoral, is basically out there. Anyway, let's simplify that. What is definitely out there are casual connections, one night stands, that whole thing. Casual relationships that may last 2-3 months, something like that. Plenty of people are interested in those for whatever reason, and longer term relationships, let's say 6 months, a year, 2 months, 2 years or longer. But if we're not open about what we want, we can't find the people that we're compatible with in that area. And again, they're out there. It's much better to find the person who wants what you want already and is compatible with that, versus finding someone and hoping or trying to change them, which doesn't tend to work and isn't kind of really fair on anyone anyway, to impose your kind of wants and needs on them. But those people are out there, but you have to kind of advertise that.
And it's fair to say that I think that you have to be ready for it as well. You have to be well primed.
Yeah.
I know that I've been in a situation where I ended, quite a long-term serious relationship, and I wanted to get back into another one.
Right.
And even though I was kidding myself and saying, no, I can move on. I literally was not ready.
Right.
So I remember, sitting, talking to my therapist about it, and I was like, "Do you think I'm ready? Do you think I should start like dating people properly?" He was just like, "No,
Right.
well, he didn't say it in that way. He was just like, maybe not yet, because I think there's something to
Yeah.
be said about really checking in with yourself, finding connection, literally rooting yourself inwardly, doing your introspection, what have you, and asking yourself if you are genuinely emotionally and physically available to allow someone in. And if you are,
Exactly.
great. But, you don't have to necessarily, because I think basically what I'm saying, I think a lot of people kid themselves and they go on dates saying, I want a long-term relationship, but actually they either don't really, or they're not ready for one, or they're not prepared.
100%. Well, and this is the kind of the two big things I talk about again and again in the book are authenticity, which is kind of knowing yourself and knowing how you feel and what you want and all of that stuff, and vulnerability, which is kind of sharing your authenticity with others. And you're completely right that like a huge part of it is just knowing how you feel and what you want, but also knowing that it's okay if you tell someone you want a serious relationship and you try and do that, you go on a few dates and you start to realize that you're not ready for that, then it's also okay to say that. It's like nobody ever reaches 100% authenticity or vulnerability. We're always kind of learning about ourselves and what we want and navigating that. And that's part of it as well, is just being able to say, yeah, I kind of want a long-term relationship. I'm not sure I'm completely ready for that yet, but maybe we can take it slow or something like that. And the other person might say, actually, no, I don't, I'm ready to jump in. But if you don't have that conversation, A, if you don't recognize where you're at and what you need, that's a big part of it. But B, if you can't have that conversation with someone else, that's a big reason that people get into these kind of difficult or relationships where someone really gets hurt or someone really gets upset or is kind of like banging their head against the wall because the relationship's not going where they want, but the other person maybe said, I'm not ready, So there's all of that stuff. But again, it's just normal. It is, after a long-term relationship, everyone needs some time to reset before the next one. Most people do.
Yeah, they're big life moments, life changing, arguably.
Exactly.
So just to cover off the rejection, so you talk a lot about, as you just did, being really clear in communications, and I personally totally agree. I think it's so important, and it is so difficult, by the way.
Yeah.
Like, it's not easy to be totally honest with people about what you want and what maybe you don't like in them or
exactly.
The alternative that is quite prolific is ghosting. So do you have
heard of it?
Yeah,
I've heard of it.
I don't think a single gay person I know has not experienced some form of ghosting or even being the ghoster, which I think
right. Well, and most of us do it one way or another. Like, we've all been there, but yeah.
How does it work? What's the psychology? Why do we do it? And why is it so bad?
Yeah. So the big thing, so ghosting, just to define, I'm sure lots of people know, I have an idea, is basically rejecting someone by disappearing on them. So you don't say, I'm sorry, this isn't working for me, good luck. You just stop communicating. And again, ghosting in this day and age is kind of inevitable because most of us, if we're on the apps, we're talking to way more people than we could ever, we could literally spend your entire life on the app, whatever. So there is always going to be a limit to what we can do. And probably if somebody, you have a 2-line conversation with someone and you don't respond, that's not kind of really ghosting, because people are less likely to feel, you're not likely to feel crushed if, on either side. So ghosting specifically is, when somebody drops you in a way that feels especially hurtful because you felt like you'd built a connection with them. That's usually the way I define it. So for example, if you've been on 2-3 dates, someone is like, hey, are we going to hang out again? And they don't get a response. That's the kind of ghosting that really tends to sting. And the reason for that is a few different reasons, but the kind of main reason is that not only are you being rejected, but it also kind of comes with a side of, you're not worth my authenticity. You're not worth me telling you. You're not worth my consideration even. You're not worth me saying to you, hey, I just, it was nice to meet you, but I just want to manage your expectations. this is not working for me. Hope you find your person. Something like that. And again, it comes with us being way more connected to more people than most of us can really handle. And that just sort of comes with the app. But it is a feature of the way we date as a community. And part of the problem with the rejection sensitivity we talked about is that it tends to hurt, it tends to sting, and it can very easily make us be like, oh, well, I'm just either like, well, I'm just going to treat everyone else like that if that's how we treat each other. Or like, I'm just not going to go on dates anymore. Like, you know, this person I'd met 3 times actually kind of upset me by not being clear and honest with me. And so it's kind of a community level thing that we kind of pass on to each other in a way that ghosting in itself, you know, there's some really not great things going on in the world right now, you know, and ghosting is not the worst of them, obviously, but it does really sort of affect the tone or the tenor of what dating is like, especially for gay, bi, queer men in the kind of age of the internet.
Yeah, it creates, I think, quite a toxic culture. And I think it also breeds, or it plays into Instagram culture and validation seeking behavior. Yeah. And to your point, I think if we're in the context of, you know, ghosty, however you want to, being ghosted and ghosting, there's this kind of like fuck you mentality that comes with it a lot of the time. And I think it's really, really nasty because we know, like, I've had conversations with friends that it's like, this dick ghosted me, but he's looked at my stories and he's out. He's not posting who he's with, so he's obviously on another date. And it's that whole, I think, to wrap it all up again, is like, it's just so disingenuous, it's inauthentic, and ultimately it's just not very nice.
And that's the thing. And it, you know, and again, there's levels of ghosting, but it does. It can really make us feel like our community is not a nice place to be. And again, that's partly because of rejection sensitivity, but it also is just, ghosting is just not. Yeah. It's not a very considerate thing to do.
No.
And part of it is, I think a lot of us just don't know there is a really simple alternative, which is just to say, hey, it was really nice to meet you. This is not working for me, or I've met someone else I've really clicked with. I hope you find your person. You know, there's so many ways to be. I think the phrase I use in the book is to like reject someone with love. You know, none of us, I think most of us would agree, none of us feel owed a relationship from a certain person. You know, and actually in my experience, I think Hinge did a study on this. Something like 80% of people or 90% of people, something like that, said they would rather be told than left hanging. So a lot of us kind of pause it. They're like, oh, if I turn someone down, are they going to be like really upset? They're going to be like pissed off with me, and you know. But actually, and this has kind of been my experience. You know, my thing with ghosting is just like if somebody's clearly trying to get a response from you, to know where you're at. If they just want to know, do you want to hang out again? Do you want to keep in touch? It is a really, I was going to say courteous, but it's almost less than that. It's like a basic thing to do if you're going to be in this dating game, if you're going to be playing this thing of trying to find the right person, because like you're going to be on the other side of this some other time, is just to say, hey, it was nice to hang out. This is not working for me, or this is not what I want, but you're really great. I hope everything works out. Good luck. I'll see you around. Or if you want to be friends, like whatever you need to say in the situation. But I think, we just don't really have that as a culture. And I think that's a big shame, because I think it would radically change the way we date if it was more normal. If you could rely on people, A, to be direct about what they want, but B, to be direct about what they want, even when they have to say thanks, but no thanks, you know.
Yeah, of course. And I also think we should expect no less. I kind of feel
exactly.
like we shouldn't play the role of the chaser. You know, if someone's not replied to you and you've had to double text and it's been 3 days after your 4th date, then I personally would argue, and I'm quite hard-lined in general, but I would say that's a sign in itself, and it's not good enough. And like my friends, and I've definitely played that role before when I was much more innocent and younger. But I would chase and double text, be like, "Hey, how was your week?" Even though he hadn't replied to me since last weekend. Like, what am I doing? Like, he's not interested. end of, move on.
Well, exactly, and that's how you deal with it. Like, it doesn't. If somebody's not interested in you, it kind of, and on one level, it doesn't matter how they show it. Obviously, it's better if they can be direct. And again, this is part of the thing of most of us are talking. Sometimes ghosting happens because someone is like, oh, I'll get, I feel like I have to tell them something difficult, which is slightly difficult, which is to turn them down. I'm super like slammed with work right now. I'll do it in 3 or 4 days, but then 3 or 4 days later, you've forgotten about it because something else, and that can happen. And that, that can happen. But yeah, I think the more we move forward to this culture of, being clear with each other, even when, it's not what we want to hear, but also like accepting that if someone, the classic thing of like no response is a response, like that. Yeah. We're never going to live in a perfect world where everyone tells us everything. That's not going to exist. Respect the dead. If somebody has ghosted you, then wish them well. Do them a little funeral, hold a little funeral for what you shared together, and move on. Because you can, and I have friends that have done this and often got a response and sent like a paragraph of, hey, it was nice to meet you. Like, I really wish you told me if you'd moved on. You can do that. My thing usually is just move on. Find someone who is interested in you and can communicate with you. Like,
that's so funny.
Do that.
I went on a few dates. I literally went on like 3 dates with someone, but I was really into him. This was a while back, and then he ghosted me. He ghosted me / it was the classic fizzle out, phase out, and then ghost approach, which people like to take because I think it makes them feel better. And then I wrote this massive essay about how disappointed and how how shameful it is and blah blah. And I sent it to a few mates, and I actually sent it to my therapist as well. I was like, thoughts, and they were just like, no. Drop it.
You can. It's not that it's like the worst thing ever to do, because in a way that is a kind of vulnerability to say to someone, hey, you kind of hurt me, and I just wanted to let you know that is a kind of vulnerability.
But it just benefits you. It's not going to change the situation.
Well, and I think that's the thing. Often it's like the thing with ghosting is like you deal with like your shit. Let them go through life like not being able to communicate very well, which is often what it comes down to, or being so afraid to like share their feelings.
Yeah, it's their
that's their responsibility. Yeah, it's not always quite as black and white as that, but it often is a version of that. And like, hold them a funeral, have the funeral for the relationship, and deal with your side that it hurts, and like you wish it had gone a different way, and you wish at least he'd had the respect to turn you down gently. But go find someone who can communicate with you, because there are plenty of people like that out there. So go find them. Spend your energy on finding them and keeping them.
I love that. I love that concept of hold them a funeral, because I remember being told archive the WhatsApp conversations, delete the photos, make sure that the memories are gone, because the longer that you get triggered by it, the more it will stay in your mind, and it's just not helpful. Oh God, I could talk to you all day.
Or I was going to say the other thing, and basically the book exists because of a really bad ghosting. It was like one ghosting too many. So you can always spend 1.5 years writing a book if that is what you need to do to process, just to put that out there.
Oh, I'm sorry you had to deal with that. But
no.
Silver lining and all that, you're quite right. Let's talk about sex. Because that's a big part of culture, queer culture. In the book, you write about commandments. Can you just unpack that a little bit for me?
Yeah, so I kind of came up with these 7 sex commandments, I called them. I thought I would just kind of play on that. And the big thing with that, one of the big things I think for sex for us as a community is, there's a few different sides to this, but the main thing is that like we all get the right, and I guess the responsibility to like have the relationship with sex that we want to have. And what I mean by that is it's things like, should you have sex on a first date? Like there's no right or wrong. There's kind of pros and cons to both, but like that is something you can kind of only find the answer to yourself. And some people are like, I feel better if I wait till the second or third date. That's a perfectly valid, way to live your life. Actually, I'm not that bothered. And if it goes that way, I'm happy to do that, is also a perfectly valid way to live your life. Part of this is like, we just live in a society with a lot of sexual shame anyway. It's nothing to do with being queer, being LGBTQ, although that kind of adds layers to it. We just live, there are no sex pleas with British. And it's not just British culture, North American culture is similar, where like we don't talk about sex, or sex is something to be kind of like not avoided, although it can be, but certainly not something you would be open about with probably with your family, maybe with friends and stuff like that. But this idea that sex is a shameful thing is where that comes from. And then, and then on top of that, there is the kind of the homophobia is often about sex more than anything else. Like homophobes don't really get mad about like two men living in the same house. That's not, they're not that bothered about that. Usually it's about that they're having sex, and two people of the same gender should not have sex, which is obviously not true, and not what happens in nature and others, in other species and things like that as well. So it's really just about, and I can't remember them, so please don't ask me to quote them off the top of my head, the exact 7, but it's things like, your relationship with sex is going to change over time as you kind of grow and things like that. It's things like being aware of what you want physically from sex, but also what you want like emotionally. And sometimes sex is about intimacy and connection more than like physical connection. It's partly about consent and you getting to decide what you do and don't want to do with your body, and respecting other people's decision on that. But and partly about communication. Again, we're talking about like saying the kind of relationship you want. Like it's the same with sex. Like, the more open you are about what you want, it doesn't mean that the other person or other people you're trying to have it with will exactly want to do what you want to do. But if you're so ashamed you can't communicate that kind of leads to all kinds of problems. Sometimes kind of quite big consent problems, but even if it's not at that level, if you don't ask, you don't get sometimes, in all kinds of things.
Yeah.
So,
and it's interesting because you're talking about gay sex being, a shameful thing in the eyes of some homophobes. And I guess it all stems back to like the sodomy laws. And, it was actually, it was illegal for a very, very, very long time in this country. And it was actually only been legalized for, to your point.
Relatively recently.
Very, very recently. But even then, there is still shaming from within the community, isn't there? Because there's slut shaming, bottom shaming, open relationship shaming. Tell me a bit more about that.
Well, but that's exactly the thing, that it's like there's all of this cultural baggage from, that basically in some way says people shouldn't enjoy their bodies and shouldn't enjoy or shouldn't like explore their sexual, desires. And why is the answer. It's a bit more complicated than that, but like why, again, a lot of the baggage we inherit from homophobia, whether we want to call it internalized homophobia or just from something more subtle than that, is a lot of us still have this thing of like, oh, if I do this, if I have this kind of sex, what does that say about me? And we get that from our own community as much as outside. And it really is that internal journey just to kind of get over that. And by that, I don't mean you have to be like super kinky and like, going to sex parties every weekend, although you can if that's what like. Being sex positive is not about having all the sex in the world or whatever. It's just saying, again, it's like the authenticity thing of like, what do you want? Like, what do you want from your sex life? Which again might be like relatively vanilla sex twice a month, and that's fine. But because of shame and because of all this baggage around, like you say, like slut shaming, bottom shaming, whatever it is, it stops a lot of us having the sex we could be having, and it stops us a lot of us being able to enjoy ourselves and our bodies and our relationships and partners and all of that in ways that we could, because we're kind of worried what it says about us. If I do whatever, what does that say?
And I think, correct me if I'm wrong here, but it is quite a wildly under-researched topic, isn't it? As in, when I was doing research for this podcast and actually other podcasts, when I've spoken to relationship experts, what have you, there are questions that people ask themselves in and out of relationships, very, very basic ones, how much sex should I be having? How much
Yeah.
masturbation should I be having? And there's all these kind of questions that people have, and there are no answers. There is no rules. And I think you
Exactly.
in the book write about how there's this concept of sex in your relationship is better than sex outside of a relationship. And I think a lot of people, well, we're bred or groomed to believe that that's true, but actually it's not always true, is it?
Exactly. And there was one, I can't remember the exact piece of research that I read that basically said that exactly, but it's in the book. But yeah, it is a myth that relationship sex is always better than casual sex. And I would say that's definitely been true of my experience. But it even comes down to things like sometimes with a casual partner, you do feel more uninhibited because you kind of don't care. If it's with a longer term partner and you're like, hey, by the way, my kink is whatever, if they're like a little bit, they should, you'd hope that a partner should like at least entertain that conversation, even if they're not into it, but be able to kind of have that conversation with you. But obviously with a casual partner, if they're like, oh my God, you're a total weirdo, I never want to see you again. You might be a bit hurt by that, but at least you'd be like, okay, well, fine. But obviously if you said that to a longer term partner. So, and it can be things like that. But yeah, we do often just have this bias that that long-term relationships are the only kind of relationship or best kind of relationship, and they're absolutely not. But certainly, yeah, again, in terms of the sex we have, or or want, or whatever, that it's always better in a relationship. And hey, there are advantages, or it's a different kind of sex with someone you love and you kind of connected to emotionally in that way is going to be different. But sometimes, we might get onto the open relationship thing in a second, but sometimes the way I talk about it in the book is like stability and variety. And in almost everything in life, we need some stability, but we also like chase novelty and want different things sometimes. And sometimes casual sex can be that. It can be like, oh, there's someone cute, like maybe I'll never see him again, but like I'm curious, I'm interested to see, and that can fill you up in one way, a different way that, relationship sex might not. And they're all valid. They're all like very, not just valid, but very human and normal things.
And it all comes back to kind of like needs met psychology.
Yeah,
we all have
100%.
different needs and different levels of intimacy. Because I guess when you're in a relationship, it's sex arguably plays a lesser role in the foundation of your relationship. I think, having cuddles and watching a movie together, having a nice takeaway on the couch or whatever, and snuggling up is, in my opinion, just as if not more important than the sex. But that changes over time. What have you?
Well, and they're just all parts of like they're all just different parts of the same thing. And and some people do, of the things you mentioned, some people do two of those at once. Whatever it is, like they can all be parts of how you build intimacy and connection with someone on a short-term or long-term basis. And it's just about knowing what's right for you and what you want at any given time,
So let's it's almost like you knew what was coming up. Let's talk about the open relationship thing, because I guess based on what you're saying, if I'm interpreting this correctly, it's that what you're making is a case for open relationships.
Well, I think the case, it's the same with sex, that like sex positivity doesn't mean, you have to go out this week and get like boned by 40 different people. That's not what sex positivity is about. You don't have to. And like the open relationships thing is the same. The open relationships thing, open relationships as a concept are the same, that like, lifelong monogamy is just one kind of relationship. And actually, if you look at the history of relationships, it's a relatively recent thing, like the past sort of 50, 60 years, that kind of, marriage has been around a lot longer than that. But yeah, in terms of like societal values, that's really the only kind of relationship. And hey, and put it this way, how many relationships that say they're monogamous, that are monogamous in theory, are actually monogamous in practice? I'm not just talking about queer relationships here. How many straight relationships are actually open relationships by stealth, which is something we call, mostly known as cheating. And that's not to condone cheating, because obviously that really, that tends to really damage trust and really hurts people. But I think one of the nice things about LGBTQ relationships is we don't feel as kind of burdened to societal norms. Like most of us at some level, we're kind of breaking the rules in, in at least one way, by dating people of the same gender, or building relationships with people of the same gender. And I think that's the thing about open relationships, that for some people, open relationships are definitely not for everyone. There are good and bad reasons to be in open relationships. I go into them in the book, or some of them in the book. But for some people, actually having the open relationship basically gives them the best of two different worlds. One, that they have this dependable partner, this person they can build a life with, whether that means living together or just having that stable person they can depend upon, they can send silly memes to, they can rely on for support. But at the same time, the kind of curiosity or sense of adventure or just novelty they're still able to kind of feed that. And for people in happy open relationships, they're not mutually exclusive. They're happy to kind of have both. And again, that's the big thing with this. It really just comes down to knowing what's right for you. And for some people, that is monogamy. That is I actually don't want to complicate my life. I just want to build something with one person. For some people, it is some kind of an open, and there's tons of different kinds of open relationships or polyamorous relationships of different kinds, thruples and things like that. And again, it comes down to knowing what you want and talking about it with your partner, basically. And yeah, some open relationships are completely open, and it's kind of, well, we're together as a couple, but we're both going to go off and do whatever we want. Some have more limitations, we only play together with other people, or we can do it, but we're not going to talk about it. I don't want to go there, whatever that is. So it's not closed versus open relationships. There's all kinds of...
It's a spectrum, like most things.
Yeah, exactly. And it's kind of finding what's right for you. There's that great word, I think it's Dan Savage. I think Dan Savage came up with it, of monogamish, of mostly being monogamous, but maybe occasionally, you have a conversation about this and you're like, well, yeah, if once or twice that happens.
Yeah.
And again, this isn't me saying what anyone should do. I'm just saying what is possible,
reality.
Or what exists. Yeah. And again, a couple of things. One is, it is a lot to expect one partner to kind of give you everything, to be your best friend and to be your only sex partner and to always be able to support you and fill your needs. And that's why we have more than one friend. We don't expect to rely on one friend to give us everything we need from friendship. And again, for people who are in happy open relationships, I think that's the kind of philosophy of, it doesn't have to damage your kind of primary or main relationship. And again, just to be clear, I'm not saying everyone should be in an open relationship. It's definitely not right, for a lot of people. And it's the kind of thing that if you aren't super confident in yourself, if you get jealous quite easily, if you worried that other, people would threaten your main relationship, you're probably going to have a really difficult time in an open relationship. Maybe it's just not for you. But I guess one of the underlying things with that is, for all of us, and again, it's kind of slut shaming, bottom shaming, open relationship shaming is totally a thing of well, if they don't just want to be with each other, they should just break up. Or what's my favorite of an open relationship is just cheating with extra steps. It's not. I mean, it can be. There are unhappy open relationships. There are unhappy closed relationships. But for some people, it definitely brings them more happiness and fulfillment than a closed relationship should. And I would just hope we can all accept that what's right for someone else isn't necessarily what's right for us, and that's great, And
I think that's fair. I've certainly been on a journey of trying to not open relationship shame people, because I think, growing up in a very heteronormative world with, traditional family values, what have you, it's like a bizarre concept to a lot of, new gays. They're like, what? So you're like together, but you're not. And like getting my head around that was a lot to deal with. And then obviously as I've got older and as things, develop and progress, I've met a lot of friends who are in open relationships. And I'm so, and always have been, extremely fascinated with open relationships, because I think a lot of people are, certainly my straight friends are, they're like, can you just walk me through like the rules? How does it work? And I think to your point, what we've uncovered is that there are many different types. Everyone will have different rules. But I think, and you've made a strong case. I would argue that I think sometimes we over romanticize the idea of open relationships, in that you can have your needs met in many different ways. And that's true. Who wouldn't want to go and get their needs met? My worry is, and the reason why it's not something I would want to be in, is that I think the practicalities are complex and not clear. And when there is ambiguity or vagueness, I think it can open floodgates for lots of things to go wrong. But, like to your point, I've heard lots of success stories. I just think on the whole, from my experience, it's a net negative outcome.
Right. And I think you're totally right that that's the kind of flip side of it. It's the freedom isn't free thing, that like you might have all this freedom, but like if your relationship is so open that it's really hard to like invest in your primary partner properly, then that's going to come at a cost as well. And that's the, I feel like I make the case for open relationships because there is so much like, so many of us have these hang-ups about like, should they even exist? Are they immoral? Are they I'm not saying it would say they're ruining society. Some people would, but a lot of us do have the I don't know about that. But that's the thing. If the monogamy is simple, that's a big part of it. That for some people that, and that simplicity is what they need and want. And, a monogamous relationship can fulfill some people in all the ways, that they want to be fulfilled. And that's fine as well. So it really is just like knowing, and some people try an open relationship and they actually, okay, this is actually a bit complicated. And like somebody maybe oversteps a boundary or they haven't really talked about it properly and someone gets upset. And it's perfectly fine to be like, maybe we just need to be closed as well. So this is not about me saying if you're not in it's not that open relationships are more evolved or are more, the kind of ultimate form we're all supposed to, evolve into. But it is about saying that they are an option. And for some people, certainly at some points in their life, they bring more fulfillment than a closed relationship might. But equally for some people, the simplicity of just knowing, we're just us and that's it. Everyone else is at best a friend. It is also a really great way to build a relationship.
Interesting.
So things to think about.
Things for food for thought. And again, I could do a whole podcast episode on it because it is fascinating from a cultural perspective, a psychological perspective. Like all of those things just play a role in how we build relationships, which kind of leads me on to the next section, which is around like gay culture in general and the apps and what social media has become. And sometimes I look at this through the lens of good fortune, because I don't know how old you are. I'm 32. I'm
36.
You're 36. You probably had a longer period of time without Instagram and TikTok than I did. But I felt like we were on this like weird cusp, the millennial cusp of like only having MySpace and Facebook to upload albums. And now it's like Instagram and gay influencers, which has become a thing recently, where you see all these like really hot, six-packed, muscle Mary Barry's going couples in LA and New York and London, and they're just like posting their best lives. And I feel like, okay, I sound like a very bitter person today.
No.
I feel like that plays a role in gay culture as well, and this kind of tribalism and hierarchy. Just wondered if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I have loads of thoughts, but the kind of highlight or the headline is, obviously that exists and that like versions of that have existed, before. But you're right, like social media kind of has supercharged that. And I think a lot of it comes down to, as you said, or like definitely implied, that like a lot of us feel like we're supposed to be that, or like that is the epitome of, you know, who we're all supposed to be as, you know, as queer men. And it does lead to all kinds of, you know, it does lead to a culture where we do tend to prize like muscularity and physical beauty in ways that I don't think help us in different ways. You know, and that's the thing. There's nothing wrong. You know, there is nothing wrong with caring about how you look or caring about your fitness and things like that. I think the hard thing for me, or the thing that I think we should be aware of, is that in terms of building happy relationships, like I talk about this, I have a whole chapter on body image in the book, but like muscles don't bring you a good relationship. You know, they might bring you a photo on Instagram that gets all these likes and whatever, and you know, we can decide whether that's a good or bad thing. I don't necessarily think it's a bad thing, but I think one of the, you know, and I'm equally not here to say that, you know, everyone with muscles is like a terrible, insecure person and like they only work out because they hate themselves, because that's not true either. You know, I have plenty of friends who like do CrossFit and Barry's and whatever, and they're also really nice people and take really good care of the body.
Yeah, I guess some of them can be nice.
Exactly. But I think there's two sides to this. One is I think we really have to, I talk about this a lot in the book, of like, you know, if somebody looks like that, that's great, but it's also like, what else do they have to offer as a partner? Because there are people who primarily, you know, the kind of main thing they offer is a body, and like if you want to hook up, then fine, that probably doesn't matter. But if you want something longer term, you also want to be paying attention to like, is this person nice to me? Is this somebody I can connect with on a vulnerable level? Is this someone I can open up to, you know, like that? But I also think what's really interesting, I sort of had this like realization while I was writing the book, is that like actually those people that you're kind of talking about, they're actually like a tiny minority within the gay male community. Like somehow, you know, and we can dive into this a bit more maybe if we want, but they're actually a small number of who we are. And so it's really interesting to me that they get to be held up as who we're supposed to be, or who, if we're not, we're less than, or whatever. And I think what I mean by that is there is every kind of queer person out there, of gay man out there. And some of us, you know, plenty of us have lots to offer that is not just a body, that is, you know, somebody who maybe is a great friend or a great partner to be with because they're really caring and attentive. There are so many different types of gay people, gay men, even specifically.
And I think one of the things that a lot of gay men struggle with, even up until their 30s, is finding their people.
Yeah,
I think when
exactly.
people come out of the closet and you might have just graduated from uni, you've moved back to London, and you're a gay person with lots of straight friends, and then you go on Instagram, and I've talked about this a lot on TikTok specifically, and you go on Instagram and you see a crew of 30 plus half-naked men on Clapham Common taking a group picture, and then you see them at Jackie O's that summer, or you see a picture of people at Freedom, on a booth together, and you're sat there thinking, where are my friends? Where are my people? And I kind of feel like, to what we were talking about earlier, is culturally the LGBT community can be extremely exclusive, and there is. Me and my friends talk about this a lot, and it's I've had over the years, in the last 10 years, since been out for a lot longer than that, but the amount of different WhatsApp groups I've had of like gay friends that have just died because someone backstabbed someone in the back by sleeping with their ex or whatever is just like insane.
Yeah.
But now I'm fortunate enough to have a nice group of guys. But we talk about Mean Girls, like the Mean Girls of London. And to your point, I'm not saying that all these people are bad, because I actually know a few of them and they are lovely. And I think social media doesn't do them any justice because it presents them as quite horrible, toxic people. But I think again, to what we were talking about earlier, like we as a culture, as a society, as a community can do a much better job of making people feel included, because sometimes, like, you know, I don't know if you've seen on TikTok, there's an account called like the Mean Gays.
Yeah, I've seen the Instagram version. Is it the same people doing the same account?
Yeah. And it's just so, I mean, obviously it's extremely embellished and exaggerated, but I think there is truth there.
Right.
Like and
that is true. There is a lot of like the tribalism, the exclusivity, and kind of, it sounds like it is a bit of a simplification, but a lot of it is like ways we respond to like a lack of self-love or the kind of fear that we're not enough. And this is, you know, I'm sure a lot of people listening will have read books like The Velvet Rage, and, you know, Velvet Rage was super influential on my book. But this idea that like we don't feel like we're enough, you know, we don't feel like we're valid as people, so we have to find ways to compensate for that. And, you know, and that can be like having the most beautiful body that exists, you know, having expensive clothes, living in a fancy apartment in a fancy city. You know, for me, it partly is like making great artworks and writing good books and stuff like that. That's kind of that's slightly my version of like the, you know, the mirror selfie of like, you know, I'm sure the same of like, if I just write the best book ever, put the best podcast out there ever, everyone is going to love me. Or I have, you know, the best body ever, everyone is going to love me and I will finally feel happy. But of course, you know, that never happens. You know, you never get there. But so it's the kind of different size of that. So there is that. I talk about it in the book, but there was a paper, I think it came out in 2020 by some researchers. And you mentioned it before, this idea of what's called intra-minority stress. And this is what this is all about, basically, that for a long time, people assumed that LGBTQ people had kind of mental health issues because they were rejected by society as a whole, and that made them feel kind of less than and whatever. And basically it is that, but it's also the ways we reject each other and we dismiss each other and we're like rude to each other and not exclusive and, you know, exclusionary. That's the word I'm looking for with each other. And part of it is just because most of us have this like hurt child, this hurt person who just wants to be accepted. You know, I'm massively simplifying now, but that basically is it. And one of the things this paper found in 2020 was once. And by the way, I don't think this exists as much among lesbians. It's like a gay male thing much more than anything else. But once people become aware of it, once people become aware that that little catty aside or that piece of gossip or that way that like someone is polite and says hi to you in a gay bar and you're just like, those things really do create this community. It's like ghosting is another example, but these are ways that we create this community where we're all really desperate for acceptance and belonging among our peers, among people like us. But we don't find it because so many of us just almost aren't even aware of how our behavior is creating this, even though we might be the recipients of it another time. And what the research has found is once people become aware of it, often that's enough. Once people are aware that like, even a tiny thing of, you know, someone says hi in a bar and you're just like, you could just be like, oh, hi, and like move on and just not engage with them. And they're probably not going to feel rejected, you know, and you've made clear that maybe they're just not your type or you're not looking to make new connections or whatever. And that's fine. But they're not going to go away and be like, oh, why was that guy such an asshole to me when I just said hello? You know?
Don't internalize. It's so true. And again, it's taken me years of therapy to really internalize that. But once you start to understand the wounded child, what its role is in your everyday life, you begin to view the world slightly different, and the way people interact with you slightly different. And then you kind of rise above things. You feel much more self-assured. You know, I learned a lot about, you know, not being the victim. No one's out to get you. Your wounded child just has unmet needs and you just need to sort of nurture it a little bit. And I think you're totally right. I've never really positioned it that way. But once you become aware of it, I think the world, like the way you view the world will start changing.
Yeah. And I think just to kind of go off the thing you were saying about community, like one of the things writing the book really kind of clarified for me is like, given the choice of, having, being in a photo with like 10 muscular people in Mykonos or whatever. Not there's anything wrong with that, versus having like 5 or 6 close gay queer friends that I can talk to about stuff. I know what I would choose. And the two aren't mutually exclusive, by the way. There are people who
Obviously,
not in Mykonos right now because it's November, but there are people who go to Mykonos who are also very supportive to friends and things like that. So it's not black and white, but it's interesting that we prize that as the thing we should all want, when I think actually what we really need and what we really want is even, like 5 or 6 close LGBTQ friends.
Oh,
maybe not LGBTQ, but like who accept us, who we can say, yeah, I went on this shitty date and like, why did he ghost me? And I just need to like get that off my chest or whatever. That's really what most of us want, I think.
Absolutely. And maybe it's just something, I mean, I know that now as a 32-year-old, the 24, 25-year-old version of myself would have probably come up with something different. I would have messaged the gays and be like, let's go here. Everyone's going. It looks good. And then, but it still happens. I see it, in my 30s, there are people doing that. But it takes time, it takes experience, and it takes a lot of work on yourself. But let's move on to talk about dating tips and coaching and kind of what you do for a living, because I think this is really interesting because there are very few people like you out there helping people. So talk me through kind of what a relationship expert / coach. I mean, what are you? How do you describe yourself?
So relationship coach, dating and relationship coach, specializing specifically with queer men, with gay, bi, pansexual queer men. It's kind of so. A lot of people, but a lot of queer people especially have experience with therapy, and there is some overlap. There is some overlap in that. I sometimes call it therapy light, so there's a lot of kind of like we've been talking about of like diving into what beliefs or kind of values do you hold that are not helping you in some ways, that are stopping you putting yourself out there. Or kind of making you feel shitty about yourself, which will stop you putting out there. So there's some of that, but it's generally coaching is like more practical than therapy. So it's also typically a therapist is not going to say, okay, well, why don't you do this week? Why don't you try that? It's a lot more about emotions and history like that. So I do a few different things. On my Instagram, there's regular content, maxthomas.net. There's stuff out there that's just kind of little things. They're kind of like mini essays, like short slide essays, just designed to get people thinking about different things that maybe they've not thought about before, or providing a kind of model of like things you can do or try to think about to build better relationships, stuff like that. But I also do a lot of one-to-one work, which again is kind of similar to therapy, but not quite. That it's a lot more practical. It's a lot more focused on the here and now. Because and you're right, it's a growing field right now. Coaching is a growing field in general, but specifically, queer relationship coaching. Not the only person doing it, but it definitely is a thing that's growing. And again, we touched on this. I think we've already touched on this, but for a lot of us, it's like, who do we turn to? It's difficult to know where to go to get support with relationships, because relationships are hard in general, but then for LGBTQ people there's a lot of stuff on top of that, but part of it also is just giving people a space to talk about things. And people are like, well, can I could just talk to my friends about it. And part of it is a lot of us don't necessarily have those friends that we can be fully open, about what we're worried about or where we've been. And that's just how that is.
And it was explained to me on that point as well, that sometimes your friends will actually have a bias as well against you.
And so so in a couple of ways, often like, and it's not that as a coach, I'm like, what are you doing? What are you doing you shouldn't be doing? Or like whatever. But friends tend to side with us kind of it's obviously, a coach or a therapist will accept you unconditionally and will not criticize you for anything you've done. But friends do tend to take our side when in relationship dynamics. Often we're contributing somehow. Even if it's just by engaging with someone we shouldn't be engaging. And so sometimes with friends, they can kind of you miss opportunities to really be like, oh yeah, that is a pattern. That is a thing I do that I need to not do. So it's the fact that someone, you're with someone who is neutral, the same with a therapist or any kind of coach. They're neutral enough. They're not invested in telling you what you want to hear. They can find ways to explore an issue and help you figure out, like, why am I doing that? Like, that is self-sabotaging, or that is not getting me what I want. So, so what is that? So, and often it is just, it gives people a space to really think and talk about their relationships, which a lot of people don't get, full stop, but queer people especially, it can be really hard to find those spaces.
Super hard. And also without the commitment, because a lot of people think that they have to sign up to a year's therapy, which isn't cheap. Exactly. So I think, having a relationship coach or a neutral person to offload to, I think, is a really efficient and effective way of dealing with things that are going on in your life. So how would people find out about kind of your work, your services?
Yeah, the stuff that goes on. I mean, the best thing people should do is find me on Instagram, which is maxthomasnet, where, there's tons of stuff. I post stuff relatively regularly on there as well. And there's tons of info on that. You can also go to my website, which is just maxthomas.net. And there's info on there. I don't know exactly when this podcast will go out at the moment, but I'm also looking at doing some like group stuff as well. So that's going to be more kind of, partly to be more affordable and less intense for people to get kind of small groups together to kind of, build community in a sense, but also have an outlet for people to
love that.
Talk about what's going on in their lives.
I'll put all the details in the show notes and in the YouTube description.
Yeah, that sounds great.
So all good. I know I've said this already, but I could talk to you all day.
Yeah, same.
So before we get onto your letter to your younger self, what would, if someone sat there thinking, oh my God, I'm single, why am I finding this so difficult? What are your kind of like 3 top dating tips? That's probably an unfair question.
That is a good question, because there's so much. I mean, I would say, no, this is a bonus one. I would say read my book, Boys Who Like Boys, and refuse to date anyone who has not read it. That's the main thing I would say.
Absolutely.
But no, if I had to give 3 concrete things today, I think the rejection thing, which I know we've come back to a ton of times, but I really think that is key to like get comfortable being rejected, kind of get comfortable being rejected in ways you don't want to be rejected, including ghosting, and really getting used to being like, it's not about me. Somebody ghosts me, it's about them, it's not me. And, being comfortable knowing that putting your most authentic self out there will put some people off, and that is fine because they're not the people for you, but you will find, the people who are for you. So that's kind of a big thing. The second thing I would say, kind of based on what we were talking about, is the internet in some ways is great for queer dating because it's given us ways to connect that we never would have had before, but just like get stuff offline. The more you can kind of, and I'm not saying you shouldn't use the apps, because the apps can be really great when used well. I'm on the apps. Most of us are on the apps. But the sooner you can turn things into like offline dates, and you can like focus on who someone is offline and not just who the kind of fake internet version of them is on a profile or on their Instagram or whatever, the better, to really be building like real things, not just the kind of online stuff. And the last thing I would say, which circles around some of what we've said, is just remember that like you get to define what happiness and success is in your relationships and nobody else. And I'm not just talking about open versus closed relationships. I'm not just talking about sex. I'm talking about like, what kind of relationship do you want, or what is the right partner for you? Like, what do you want and need? These are huge questions. Obviously, there's not things you're going to answer in like 30 minutes of meditation, but really learning to like focus or be driven by what do you want from a relationship? What is success to you? And again, that's going to look different from other people. It might look different from your parents. It might look different from your friends. It might look different from what kind of stereotypical gay culture is, or maybe it isn't. Maybe it is that. But I think we all have to chase what's going to make us happy and not what's going to make other people happy.
Amazing. Powerful. That could basically summarize the whole podcast in the last minute.
That's it. The 2-minute version. Right?
Yeah. Maybe it's a TikTok.
Great. Love it.
So one thing that I ask all my podcast guests to do is to write a letter to their younger selves. And I double checked that you had that before we started recording. And I always say, like, I always know when people are going to do it and when they're not. And I knew that you were the sort of person that was going to do it. I'd say like 95% of people do it, even though I ask everyone to do it. So I'm very intrigued based on kind of, all your work is about kind of self-development and personal growth, etc. I'm very intrigued as to what your letter includes. Good. So
I'm glad.
If I hand the mic to you, I'd love to hear it.
Yeah, of course. And I have done this I have done this before, by the way, at different stages of my life. So I love like letters to yourself, because you kind of learn so much about who you were and who you are. And yeah, as a writer, I just write, I could come up with stuff all day. So here's what I came up with. And what I'm going to say, I'm just going to preface this by saying this is not necessarily about a specific time in my life or my former life, but it kind of is about, it's kind of what I think I would definitely tell myself in the times things have been difficult or stressful or just felt like, I was like rudderless and didn't know what's going on, which, were things we all go through. So here we go. It goes like this. Hey, kid, I know things are difficult right now. I know you feel lost. I know you're hurt and don't know who to trust, but hang in there. You will love again. You will feel at home again. It will all make sense again. I'm not going to spoil any of the surprises, but there's so much good stuff coming. You're going to make some great art. You're going to travel to some amazing places. You're going to meet some incredible people around the world. You're going to make connections that change the way you see everything. You're going to feel feelings you didn't even know you could. You're going to experience some incredible highs and lows, but eventually you'll learn to savor them all just as part of life, as part of being alive. But most of all, you're going to be okay. Keep going. I believe in you.
I love that. Such a nice like pep talk. It's kind of the thing that we all needed to hear. If I go back to the wounded child, like it's the reassurance that things are going to be okay. And I think for a lot of us, myself included, and it sounds like you experienced this too, it's like when you were going through those dark times, you genuinely are not sure what the future holds because it's so bleak.
Exactly. And I think that's, the thing I'll say about being a coach and, and whatever, and writing these books and stuff is like 80% of the time I'm at least slightly talking to myself, sometimes very much talking to myself that, it's not almost that. It is exactly that everyone goes through difficult times in their lives, but like what makes people, it's not that successful people don't have difficulties or don't have difficult times in their lives. But what makes those people thrive and makes them happy is that they're good at getting through those difficult times, and I'm sometimes good at them and sometimes not good at them at all, but I think that's, it comes back to building that community of people who are going to kind of support you through that. But yeah, I also, one of the things I love about like writing the letter to yourself is you get to be that person for yourself. You get to be that person you needed and often still need. This is a letter to my former self, but it's kind of also a letter to like me in 2023. So
yeah, because it's almost like even though we're going backwards, it's an indication that what the future could hold as well. Like there is still exciting people to meet, exciting places to go, and more highs to come.
Exactly. And we don't know those yet. We don't know those.
No.
But
Max, thank you so much for
my pleasure.
A powerful episode. Like I'm so excited for so many people to hear this and watch it if they want on YouTube as well. And of course, I will leave all your details in the show notes. So if anyone wants to get in touch with you, please do that via Instagram or indeed the website. It's been an absolute honor speaking to you and wishing you all the success with future books. I hope I'm going to buy all of them and have bookshelves of Max Thomas books.
I love that. That's great. Yeah. Thanks so much for having me.
My pleasure. Take care. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you as always for taking the time out of your day to listen or watch this podcast. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did making it. If you did enjoy it, please like and subscribe, and don't forget to share it with friends and family as well, because it helps keep the podcast keep going and growing. Until next time, take care, stay safe, and I'll see you very soon.